So this week we examine the role of science in wrongful convictions. The use of scientific evidence presented by an expert is a very powerful tool in a criminal trial. Most of us believe that if an expert says that the physical evidence found at the scene or on the victim, things like blood or semen, teeth marks, fingerprints, if that evidence belonged to the defendant, then that expert's testimony proves that the defendant was involved in the commission of the crime. We are even more certain if the expert used DNA testing to determine that the evidence belonged to the defendant. There are several systemic problems with science that result in wrongful convictions of innocent people and inhibit their ultimate release. The most significant issue is the quality of the science. Now, forensic experts have provided testimony in criminal trials throughout much of the last half of the 20th century. Many of the techniques that they used and continue to use are not based on rigorous scientific standards. Some have characterized these techniques as junk science. The suspect techniques include things like hair microscopy, bite mark comparisons, firearm tool mark analysis, and shoe print comparisons, among others. The problem with many of these forensic techniques is that they were developed without application of scientific standards. Many of these techniques were developed as a means to solve crimes, not as part of some scientific development. Now, this is especially true for the comparison techniques, where forensic analysts claim to be able to compare things like bite marks or hairs or fibers through visual observation. No scientists were engaged in independent research on these techniques. Rather, forensic analysts developed these disciplines as they were working on a case. The analyst was presented with evidence of a fiber or a hair and determined that if they compared the hair found on the victim, say, to the hair of the suspect, they could tell if those hairs came from the same person. These forensic methods have little or no scientific validation, however. They also have had no or inadequate assessments of their robustness or their reliability, nor were they ever subject to scientifically acceptable standards for quality assurance or quality control before they were used in criminal cases. So this means that for over a century, forensic analysts have testified to scientific results where there was a non-existent or improper scientific basis for their findings. This kind of evidence includes teeth marks and voice recording comparisons. Interestingly, voice comparisons made national news recently when they were debated in the trial of George Zimmerman for the death of Trayvon Martin. The judge in that case ruled that the science of voice comparisons does not meet the required standard for admission, and she excluded any expert testimony on that particular issue at the trial. A related problem is that too often forensic analysts proffer testimony that goes further than the science supports. So many forensic techniques that have been practiced for years but not subjected to the rigors of scientific research are accepted and then repeated as fact. This testimony leaves jurors with the impression that the evidence is much more scientific than it is, and the potential for wrongful convictions increases. This is true of hair comparisons. So in the 1970s, FBI forensic analysts began to train state and local forensic analysts in the technique of hair microscopy and inflated the accuracy of those results. So FBI analysts and those analysts they trained have testified in countless thousands of trials that hairs from a crime scene matched or were consistent with the defendant's hair, even though they had no way of knowing how rare those kinds of similarities are. As a result, thousands of individuals had hair comparison testimony presented at their trials that was inaccurate or misleading. The extent of the problem is now under investigation by the FBI themselves. Improper forensic testimony is unfortunately not limited to unvalidated disciplines. As the Innocence Project in New York demonstrates through an analysis of their DNA cases, among the DNA exonerations, dozens and dozens of people were wrongfully convicted after forensic analysts misrepresented serology results. Now, before DNA testing became widely available, serology was the only way to help identify the source of blood or semen or other bodily fluids at a crime scene. So some analysts testified improperly about what serology can tell and what percentage of the population shares the perpetrator's blood type. So some failed to recognize that the biological sample that they were testing might actually be a mixture of fluids from the victim and the perpetrator. In such a case, the victim's blood type could mask the perpetrator's blood type, making it impossible to know the blood type of the perpetrator. And then in other cases, analysts provided inaccurate statistics for the percentage of the population who shared the perpetrator's blood type. Now, there are two dominant tests that a judge uses at trial to determine if a scientific expert may testify. The first and most common standard is the Daubert standard. The second is the Frye standard. Now, the Daubert standard is used by a trial judge to make a preliminary assessment of whether or not an expert's scientific testimony is based on reasoning or methodology that is scientifically valid and can properly be applied to the facts at issue. Under this standard, the factors that may be considered in determining whether the methodology is valid are, number one, whether the theory or technique in question can be and has been tested. Number two, whether it has been subjected to peer review and publication. Number three, what its known or potential error rate is. Number four, the existence and maintenance of standards controlling its operation. And then finally, number five, whether it has attracted widespread acceptance within a relevant scientific community. Now, the Daubert standard is the test currently used in the federal courts and in some state courts. And in the federal courts, interestingly, it replaced the Frye standard, which they found was less helpful. The Frye standard, however, continues to be used to determine the admissibility of an expert's scientific testimony in a number of states, including Illinois. It was established in 1923. Now, a court applying the Frye standard must determine whether or not the method by which that evidence was obtained was generally accepted by experts in a particular field in which it belongs. That's it. The National Academy of Science conducted a study of the state forensic science, and issued in 2009 an extensive report about its findings with a number of specific recommendations to try to strengthen this field and do away with some of these problems. We have a link to the executive summary of that report as part of this course, and I encourage you to read it after you've watched the videos for this week. At the heart of the recommendations is the establishment of a National Institute of Forensic Science to establish and oversee best practices in the field. That has not happened yet. Another prominent of these issues in the cases of wrongful conviction is when new science reveals that old science is incorrect, when previously accepted science is invalidated by new studies. It often takes the legal system too long to catch up. Old science is often presented and used to convict innocent people, despite that the scientific community has repudiated it. Now, two prominent areas where old faulty science has been, and unfortunately continues to result in wrongful convictions, are arson cases and shaken baby cases. And both of these cases are ones where there may not have been a crime committed at all. Shaken baby syndrome is a hypothesis that shaking by an adult can cause brain injuries in infants. Scientific advances have undermined the theory of shaken baby syndrome. Even the doctor who first proposed the theory of shaken baby syndrome has acknowledged that he was wrong. Among the prominent doctors who have disproved this syndrome is Dr. John Plunkett, and he is featured in the videos for this week. But throughout the country, prosecutors continue to prosecute individuals based on the shaken baby syndrome, and many convicted of murder that are the convictions were based on this theory continue to sit in prison. But this is changing. Audrey Edmonds, who is also featured in the videos, did have her murder conviction based on shaken baby syndrome overturned in Wisconsin. And some courts are starting to recognize that expert testimony denying shaken baby syndrome should be funded and admitted at trial, so that the jurors can at least have all of the information. Now, finally, a word about DNA. DNA was developed through extensive scientific research at top academic centers. So DNA does have scientific reliability. DNA has been a critical tool in post-conviction cases to exonerate innocent individuals who were convicted of crimes. It does this by excluding the defendant as the perpetrator. For example, when the blood or the semen collected on the victim is tested to determine the DNA of that specimen, this test may exclude the defendant as the perpetrator. That specimen could not have come from this defendant. And that's very powerful evidence. Sometimes when DNA is run through a database or compared with an alternate suspect, it can even identify the true perpetrator. So not only does this show it wasn't the defendant's DNA, but it was actually this person's DNA. And then the right person can be tried for the crime. There are nonetheless significant roadblocks to using DNA to exonerate an individual. The first problem is that most of the state laws do not require adequate evidence preservation of items that might contain DNA. They might be held in a non-temperature control room. They might be mixed together with other items that were taken from the victim or from the crime scene. Additionally, because DNA collection and testing and interpretation is done by human beings, it may still render false results because of human error. So, with that background, please now watch the videos discussing the role of science in wrongful convictions.